Mark Tanzig from Leon County. Mark, how are you doing today? We've heard what's blooming in your yard, but how are you doing?
Doing fantastic. Yeah.
Awesome. It's already getting a little warm for my liking.
Yeah. Oh, it's hot. But our open house is done. The little extension agent conference is
Yeah,
done. So now I cruise in the 4-H summer camps.
very good. Yeah, yeah. Those start it's either next week or the next here too. So,
Mhm.
and moving out west, we've got Mr. Joshua Chris. Hey, Josh, how are you doing?
Wonderful. How about you?
Doing great. Wonderful, he says. That's what we like to hear. And behind the scenes, we've got Julie McConnell, now in Washington County, and Matt Lawler, also over in Santa Rosa County, helping us out behind the scenes. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our program today. And our first question, Mark, um, could you just provide a general overview of pest management, kind of what it is, why we do it, that sort of thing? Just kind of get us started with a little introduction to pest management here.
Sure. So, this is controlling pests in the lawn and landscape. That's what we deal with a lot here on a daily basis. People calling saying, "Hey, what is this? How do I get rid of it? Is it a problem?" And I always like to have the conversation with folks of like, we can never really have this perfect landscape with no insects or no diseases or no weeds. There's like we use this term called integrated pest management or IPM for short. And this is a way to think about controlling pests in your landscape. And it's really important to try to get this across to homeowners and folks managing a landscape, is that we don't want to just kind of get to like no pest whatsoever, because that's kind of it's an unachievable goal, really. So what we want to try to do is think of, how can we minimize pests to like a level that we're happy with? So this integrated pest management, the kind of the main keys here are we are going to be monitoring and assessing the landscape, right? So just walk through your landscape, look, look under the leaves every now and again, just walk through. Are you noticing any damage to your plants? If you see something that is potentially causing damage, let's try to make sure we identify the pest properly, right? That's the next part in IPM is making sure that we see some damage, we properly identify what is actually causing the damage. There's lots of, let's say, insects out there. A lot of them are doing us no harm, right? They're just hanging out in our landscape. And so we need to be sure we're finding the cause of this damage. And then we have to decide, is the damage bad enough to actually do something, right? So we have to then, once we find something, we correctly identify it, we need to decide and evaluate, does something need to be done about this? And we're going to talk about beetles versus aphids a little bit later. That kind of gets into this whole problem with some of these insects are hard to deal with. Um, so then once we decide what we're going to do, we want to make sure we're doing something that's going to be effective. So let's, again, we know the pest, we can know all of our control methods. Let's make sure we pick the right thing that's actually going to be effective and not harm, non-target organisms. And then we need to kind of, when we're done, evaluate, hey, did this work? So that next time this pest comes around, we can use a similar strategy if it was effective, or we need to change things up if it wasn't. Because a lot of our pests that we deal with in the landscape, they come on a cycle. Every year at the same time of year, typically we see these pests come through. And so the more we're kind of monitoring and paying attention, the more we can kind of get used to these things, get prepared, and know how to best handle them. So know that you're going to have pests. Know that we need to really look into just because you see a bug, don't just start spraying whatever you find at the store, because we need to make sure it's going to actually work against the thing that's causing the problem. So I just wanted to start us off with a integrated pest management primer. And I think I got it all. Daniel, Josh, did I miss anything there?
I think that was a pretty thorough answer.
Okay, good.
That's a great start because you can't control pests if you don't have or can't control them well and responsibly if you don't have that broad overview of what IPM is. And so now that we know that that P word is pest. And what do we use to kill pests? Pesticides. And so, Mark, again, I want you to kind of give a broad overview before we get into what to do about some of these specific problems. Tell us what is considered a pesticide. So, what kind of products are actually considered pesticides, and maybe what.
So, again, pesticides are what these products we use to go after pests. When we talk about our control methods, we try to prevent as much as possible. We got some other methods we can use that maybe we'll talk about. So hand picking, chopping things down if we need to, or, pulling that caterpillar off with your bare hands. But at the very, the kind of this triangle of, working against these pests, we have pesticides and chemicals. And a lot of times people get tripped up with, I don't use pesticides, I only use herbicides, or I don't use pesticides, I only use, something with an I side at the end. But these are all grouped under pesticides, right? So if you're going after a weed, you're using herbicides. If you're going after an insect, it's an insecticide. Going after a disease, a fungus, it's a fungicide. Mites, it's a miticide, right? So there's a whole list of these ICIDEs, and they're all considered pesticides, right? And when we talk about pesticides, there's usually this active ingredient that is doing the work of targeting the pest. And a lot of times when you hear us give recommendations, we're going to really focus in on that active ingredient, because that is, how when we're kind of rating something on how well it works, we look at that active ingredient, the concentration, and how does it work against these various pests. So pesticides is all kinds of stuff, but we use it to control our, whatever the pest is that we're dealing with in the landscape.
All right, that's good. We're going to stick with you for one more question here. It's kind of a double question. You mentioned pesticides and kind of gave a broad overview. We know there's a difference between kind of man-made synthetic pesticides and some more natural type pesticides. So could you give us some options of sort of natural pesticides or non-toxic or organic type pesticides, and maybe contrast with something you could pick up that's effective but is more of a synthetic?
Sure. And we're putting these, if you look at the chat, Matt Lawler in the background there is putting up our references here. And so I think with this one, we have a really great EDIS document that is about natural pest control methods for the landscape. And so, natural methods of pest control, that's going to be where we rely on natural products, right? So, not man-made products. So these are going to be things like various oils. Maybe more like the plant oils. So sometimes citric acid is mixed with some oils, or like a citrus oil. There's these neem oils, one that many of you have heard of. These things come from, plants, come from nature. Uh, they are usually, these natural products are usually considered organic. So there's, the idea with some of these that they're going to be less impactful on the environment because they're natural, but that's not always necessarily the case, right? Even if it's a natural product, it can be used incorrectly. Um, but these natural products, again, there's oils, there's various repellents. Um, BT is an example of another more natural type pesticide. That goes after insects, caterpillars specifically. Um, so again, just because it's natural, I do want everyone to know that doesn't necessarily mean it's always safer. You still have to wear protective equipment. You still need to be careful, read the label on how you use those products. But I also want to mention that, sometimes folks want to make up their own products, right, at the house. And, soap and oil with some water can be effective, but we really want you to just go get those, pesticide products, those products at the store that are labeled as a pesticide, because truly, by law, those are the ones you have to use against pests, right? So soap is intended to clean your hands. They didn't create it to go after pests. Those products that they sell in insecticidal soaps, right? That is, soap and oil and water, but they've been mixed in a way that's going to be effective and safe for you and your plants, and actually, treat the pests that you're going after. So there are lots of natural methods out there. But ideally, you're going to want to go for the ones that are formulated specifically for pest control.
Great answer. And kind of to finish up our introduction before we do hit some specific pest control questions, there's two more things I want to ask you, Mark. The
Okay.
first one, I heard you mention that
Josh is here,
I know that Josh is here. I'm just going. I've got an organized list, and you happen to be
All
the
right,
one who
sorry.
took all the early questions. So, Josh, you can feel free to chime in on any of these. But I'll start with Mark. So, you mentioned hand picking pests. So, when do we know when to do that versus when to break out a pesticide or an insecticide or whatever it may be?
That is a really good question. When I was mentioning IPM, right? So we monitor, we identify the pest, And at some point we make a decision to like, we have to do something or not. In farming world, there's lots of research been done on, you go out to a field, you count a certain number of bugs, that's your trigger to spray. In
Threshold.
your economic threshold, right? So in the ornamental world, it's all about the looks, and we call it the aesthetic threshold, but everyone's threshold is different. So it really is up to the person, right? The owner of this landscape to decide when is it time. Now, as far as like hand picking versus, spraying something, um, usually what it depends on is the time you have available and how many, of these things you got to hand pick, right? So we're talking about weeds. You can do a, great job, weeding by hand. It's very, you get physical activity, you get outside. And for a homeowner with a couple small little beds, that might work just fine. But think if you're a landscape management company, you got lots of places to go, you got big areas to deal with, or weeds are just insanely, they're all over the place. That's where you're balancing your time with what's going to be most effective. And so it's really up to each individual. Like if we have people that don't like to touch caterpillars on their tomato plants. And so I tell people, you can use some pliers, right? Pretend you're a bird and like go snip them off of there. Um, but usually it's going to be like the kind of pest and how many is going to help you decide on, okay, am I going to get control by just hand picking, or do I need to use something a little stronger to knock them back more quickly before I lose whatever, or have some major ornamental damage.
I think the type of pest was important. For instance, I've got an 8 foot tall sweet viburnum that's currently covered in honeydew from aphids, and I've got all these aphids. It would be it wouldn't be, guess, technically impossible, but it would be difficult to go crush all those aphids. So,
Mhm.
just keep in mind what kind of insect you're dealing with. So that's great. And I'll get this to both of you guys. You may both have an answer for this or a kind of a rule of thumb that you use. Um, but I thought that was really interesting. Are there horticultural signs to match spray times? Such as, a little bit farther north, when forsythia blooms, it's time to spray for crabgrass. Here in the Panhandle, do we have some of these kind of triggers when certain horticultural things are happening? It's a good idea to be looking out for a certain pest or that kind of thing.
Go ahead, Josh.
Okay. We don't really necessarily have any signs to say when this blooms do that or anything of that nature. We're really looking more for your pre-emergent programs, for your lawns and things like that. We're really looking for those nighttime temperatures. So at least in Santa Rosa County, that's usually right around mid-February, although with temperatures changing the way they are, that's getting a little bit earlier in the year. But we're really looking for those about 55, 60-degree nights there in the spring, and that's what's going to trigger some of your weed seeds to start to germinate. And so you want to make sure that you have those pre-emergents down before those start to germinate so that when they do, they can hit that barrier and they can kill off that seedling before you ever see it. But I don't know of any necessarily, if you see this blooming, spray at that time
Yeah,
type
otherwise
rules.
I kind of consider that this old way of thinking of pest management where we just kind of, sprayed on like a kind of a schedule or something, almost like preventatively. But really what we want to use with integrated pest management, we want you to just be out there monitoring. And, again, the weather changes from year to year, so bugs might show up a little later, a little earlier. So just be out there monitoring and, finding that kind of threshold that when you get there, that's your trigger to spray, not so much kind of just a blanket rule that everyone should go out and spray when something's blooming, because you want to be a little more specific.
True. There are a couple of things that came to mind as far as times of the year that you start looking for things. Like Mark said, I
Mhm.
wouldn't spray by a calendar, but there are, calendar triggers to tell you when things come. Like August in the Panhandle tends to be when armyworms show up. If you have Bermuda grass, for instance. Another one is like lawn burrweed. You can start looking for that around Halloween. Between Halloween and Thanksgiving is normally when it starts to germinate. So start poking around in your yard, and you may can see that coming up. Just different things like that. As you get out in the yard and learn a few things, you'll start to notice patterns, but we don't really recommend a calendar spray program. So that was a great
Yeah.
answer by both of you guys.
Yeah, it's kind of back to that cyclical thing where they come around about the same time every year and just be out there looking for them.
That's right. That's exactly right. Josh, you're finally getting your time in the sun here. First question that was going to be posed directly to you. We're getting into some specific pest control stuff. And if you guys have something out there in the audience that we don't hit on, feel free to ask in the chat or in the Q&A box in the bottom, and we'll try our best to get to those if we have time. But Josh, this question, something is eating my potato plants and I can't find the culprit. Do you have any ideas? So what are the kind of the common things that predate our potatoes?
Well, I hate to just kind of throw those generalist things out there, but the first step would be knowing your plants. We talked about at the very beginning of the webinar that we're starting to harvest our potatoes now. So it could just be that your vines have died off because that's the natural progression of that plant. And so the bugs are coming in to get it because it's dying off. But on top of that, you really want to look more into scouting. I hate to just tell you this eats that and that eats that. You really do need to get in there and you need to look, if not every day, then about every other day. Go in there, dig through the leaves, look at the underside of the leaves. You're looking for eggs. You're looking for any bugs that have already come out. You're looking for nutritional deficiencies. I mean, scouting your plants is really the step before you get into your IPM structure. And so it's super important, and there's no real way to de-emphasize it. You really do have to get out there and find the thing that's eating your plant, but you also need to know that plant's life cycle. And I think for potatoes, unless you're talking about sweet potatoes, I think potatoes were kind of getting towards the end of their life cycle for the year. And so there might be nothing you can do to stop those insects from attacking it just because it's at the end of its life for the year. And so digging them might be the appropriate response right now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at this point, if it is, a problem that's just arose here shortly, the plants, I mean, the potatoes underground are basically done. So damage that occurs to the top is going to be kind of insignificant. So
Yeah,
that's
no,
great.
I had a lot of leaf-footed bugs going after my potatoes right there towards
Yeah.
the end, but I kind of didn't worry about it because I knew the potatoes were going to get picked out soon anyway.
Yeah,
Yep,
there you
time
go.
to harvest.
Great job. So neither one of y'all signed up for this question, so I'm just going to pose it to the group here.
Oh man, I thought we were going to skip it.
No, we're not skipping it. We'll go ahead and get this one out of the way because it is IPM. Because this plant can be affected by different pests. If it's not done correctly. So I thought it would be appropriate. So how can I be successful growing hydrangeas in the Panhandle? And do they do better in the ground or in a pot? And basically, how can we grow these in a manner that will prevent us from having to use some pesticides and that sort of thing? Because we can have some hydrangea issues if they're not properly taken care of.
Yeah, I know at our gardens, our hydrangeas do pretty well. Then we hit the summertime and it gets really hot and we got high humidity. We get these like afternoon rainfall events. And usually what happens is they get leaf spot, various fungal diseases on the leaves. You try to get the right plant in the right place. So we like to, give our hydrangeas just a little tad bit of shade, right? Oftentimes they don't thrive in that full sun. So ours tend to get a little bit of shade. We try to use that micro drip irrigation. I didn't get into all the control measures, right? But one of the big things we do in integrated pest management is we try to prevent the problems before they arise, right? So trying to keep that irrigation down close to the ground, making sure we're watering in the morning so that the sun dries it off. And again, trying to prevent those fungal leaf spot diseases. And then, I mean, if it's to the point where the hydrangeas just look terrible, ratty, then maybe you go and you get some fungicide and you try to, control them that way. That's all I got, because they
Yeah.
look pretty good, but every summer they start to look a little bit tattered
They
a
get a
bit.
little tired. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. All right, Josh, how to diagnose if white grubs are in your lawn and how to control them if necessary. I've got a pretty good idea that I've got white grubs because I have an armadillo that's just wreaking havoc. I still haven't caught. I think we talked about this last month.
Yep.
And it's still going on. I've got 2 traps out. I'm doing everything. He's still doing his thing. So
Yeah,
white grubs.
armadillos are always super fun, but that is one way to tell if you have an armadillo, they're after food, and grubs are probably what they're after. And so if you do have an armadillo digging up your yard, that could be it. Moles also will do that. So if you're getting a lot of molehills, they could be going after grubs. It's important, first of all, to monitor for them. You're going to have about a 3-year cycle where your grubs are going to be an issue. And the reason it comes on a 3-year cycle is that they're actually the larval version of beetles. And so if you're noticing a lot of beetles around your property, there's a good chance you're going to have a grub issue. If you are starting to notice grub damage, which tends to happen in a somewhat circular browning pattern because they're eating the roots of your plants and kind of killing your lawn and kind of killing it off, what you can do is make 3 slices in about a 1 foot by 1 foot, and right where the brown and the green meet, and then pull that flat back, and you can actually look down there, and quite often you can find the grubs. there's a lot of things that you can do to try to prevent grubs. There are some drenches and things of that nature that you can put down for grubs. Just make sure that it's there, whatever you use is labeled for that and that you're following what the label says to use. For that, that's for your control methods. The other ways you could try to do it, some of your cultural practices, or some of your biological practices rather, is try to put some of those things that would predate the beetles out in your lawn, put habitat for those. So some flowering for those larra wasps and things of that nature. Put some flowers out there that are habitat for those. They'll come in and they could very well solve your beetle problem for you before it ever turns into a grub problem in your lawn.
Awesome. Good answer. So maybe I'll try some of those practices and the armadillo will leave me alone. So we'll see.
Doubtful.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
doubt it.
I'm just blessed with this guy. I don't know what to do. I'm at my wit's end with this armadillo.
Mhm.
We've talked about both of these pests, so beetles and aphids. So how to best control beetles and aphids on plants? Give us some idea.
All right, well, I'm gonna go the beetle thing, good luck, right? Because so beetles are really difficult to control because they have that really strong exoskeleton. So effectiveness of many pesticides you're not going to get a lot of knockdown, I would say, with pesticides against adult beetles. Josh just went over grubs, and so really, you got to catch them in that larval stage if you want any real chance of trying to control them. So that's where you have to be ahead of things, right? You have to be monitoring. You got to be, looking at your under the ground before the beetles even show up eating your plants. One little trick I have found, and I did find this through an extension document at some point, but I found it out just in my own yard when I left some old white bucket of water out in the yard, is that sometimes these beetles they are attracted to it and they just drown in the white bucket of soapy water. So you could put those out a little bit. I know those Japanese beetles go after your camellias. I forget what time of year, but anyway, they come and they leave these little half moon shaped holes in your camellia leaves. At that point, again, you're not going to get a lot of control. You just have to deal with some of the damage and try to get as many as you can, maybe crush them. Aphids, on the other hand, that's something that's doable, where you can control those not too bad. Aphids are usually going to be at the very growing tips of the plant, usually fresh growth. They're piercing, sucking insects, so they're trying to, stab into that soft stem. Insecticidal soaps, horticulture oils usually do a pretty good job of knocking them down. Insecticidal soaps especially are really good for aphid control. If it gets really bad and out of hand, there's some other, systemic type products, but I would first try with, some of these like quick knockdown products and then move on from there if you're not getting that control that you want.
Sounds good. Thank you. Josh, probably the most insidious pest that we deal with here in the Panhandle, a pest of turf grass under the ground as well. So kind of hard to know if you have it, and even harder to control it. And it's ground pearls. What can you tell us about ground pearls? What are they? And are there any control methods available?
So ground pearls are a type of scale, but they tend to be, like you said, down below the soil level. You're probably not ever going to know that you actually have them. You will see damage from it, and you'll see little zigzag patterns of damage in your lawn. About the only way you can tell that you have them is the females are these tiny little pink, about the size of a BB, maybe a little bit smaller than that. The males you'll probably never see just because they're so small. So those little pink ones are about going to be the only way that you can even discover that you have them. Unfortunately, there's not really a whole lot that you can do about it. There's no insecticides that are rated for ground pearls. We don't know of any real biological controls for them. About the only thing you can do is implement your cultural practices and just make sure that your turf grass is growing like crazy, that you're watering correctly, mowing correctly, fertilizing correctly, and that you're making those grasses grow real well. And hopefully you can grow through the damage that they're going to cause, because they shouldn't cause extensive damage. They just do, but they do cause some damage.
You could move also.
You could move, but then your new house would have them too. They are a Panhandle thing.
That is possible. Mark, moving on to some slightly larger pests here. Are there any snake repellents that work? I know, snakes provide some great ecosystem services, but at the same time, you walk out and you come upon a snake in the flower bed. It is pretty startling. So is
A
there
little
anything we
shocking,
can
yeah.
do?
Unfortunately, no, not really. So there's a document in here. So Dr. Holly Over, she was a wildlife scientist at Quincy Center for a while. She has moved to somewhere out in the Northwest somewhere, but we're going to put a good document in here where she did a whole series on living with wildlife, and she did one specifically on snakes. And she mentions in that document that unfortunately there are no really good deterrents or repellents or kind of control things. You probably all have heard of people trying to throw out mothballs, right, to keep snakes away. There's no evidence that that actually, helps. And that's if you read the directions and the label, right, because the mothballs are technically like a pesticide. If you read the label, they're not intended to be in the open, right? They're not supposed to be outside. It's damaging to lots of other wildlife. So what you do when it kind of goes to IPM again, where we are going to try to prevent the problem in the first place. So that's where you don't want to have a bunch, we encourage people to have brush piles, but just don't have one like up by where you're walking into the house because, a snake might be in there. Keep the grass kind of cut short by where you're walking around so that you don't have anywhere to kind of get cover. And if you have a rodent issue, you got to try to work on that to try to keep maybe those snakes from getting a little bit too close to the house. But like you said, Daniel, if you got a rodent problem, having a snake around maybe not be the worst thing in the world. It's important to keep in mind that most of the snakes you're going to see in the landscape are not going to be venomous. They're probably more afraid of you than you are of them. And so, have a little bit of respect. I know they're creepy, crawly, and they're scary looking, but have a little respect for them. But try to keep the ground and clear around your house so that you minimize you don't want to make it welcoming to snakes around your home.
Yeah, I mean, coral snakes are so rare. We really only have the pygmy rattler, the eastern diamondback, the water moccasin, and the copperhead are the only venomous snakes we really
Mhm.
have, and they're all fairly rare.
Well,
As far as land,
the cottonmouth's probably one you're most likely to run into, especially if you're by water. But fortunately, they let you
compared to
know
all
they're
of the
there.
other snakes, yeah, compared to all the other snake species, they're relatively uncommon. Yeah, so
Mhm.
just be vigilant. Watch out. Try to give them a wide berth if you see them. But yeah, so I'm going to tell my grandmother what you just told us that the mothballs don't work. So you walk
Well,
into her house, you can smell them from a mile away. So
well, in the house they might be work fine on moths, but they don't work outside against snakes. But I try to tell people that on a regular basis. They don't always listen to us. You extension agents know this. The folks don't always,
that's right.
pay attention to what we tell them.
That's right. Josh, we're going to come back to the lawn here with you. Um, if you have St. Augustine grass, chances are you've run into a chinch bug now and then. How can you control chinch bugs in your lawn or maybe even prevent them from being there in the
Well, and so this is going to be another deal where you're going to have to monitor. You're probably going to see the adult, but you're probably not going to see the larva, and the larva is the thing that's eating your grass. And so that's what you really got to watch out for. This is another one. There are pesticides out there for it, but they've been used so heavily that the insects are starting to develop a resistance to it. And so if insecticide is the way you want to go, it's probably going to be something you're going to need to put a bunch of applications down, and you're probably going to need to alter your mode of action, which is how the pesticide actually affects the insect, to try to get anything done. But this is another one where your best bet is to implement those cultural practices and just try to grow through the damage and just keep that grass healthy and keep it as growing as quick as you can. You're going to notice that theme with pretty much most of our turf grass pests, with the exception of a few, is that just getting your grass to grow through it is probably the best way to get around it.
Sounds good to me. Mark, we're leaving the lawn. We're coming back to our landscape beds. I guess maybe the lawn a little bit. And the main thing is that we're talking about here are fire ants. So what can we do about
Mm.
fire ants? Talk a little bit about, lawn and landscape, but then maybe like what can you do if they get in, say, your raised beds, your vegetable garden, something.
Yeah, so I know the link here is going to take you to the Sustainable Fire Ant Control page that UF put together is really good. Kind of walks you right through how you can handle them. So fire ants, yeah, they're really annoying, right? They sting. They make those, kind of unsightly mounds. What we really want to keep people from doing is broadcasting some kind of generic, non-selective, insecticide. And ideally, you're doing something that's baited, right? So you can broadcast like a baited ant product insecticide, or you can do the individual mound treatments. And the baited products are great because the ants, it's going to be selective, right? The ants are going to have to go get it and take it down to the queen. That's really the only effective way to handle, minimizing or eliminating that ant colony. But again, I say eliminating, you know what happens when you control ants, right? Another one pops up a little bit later, just in another spot. So it's going to be a constant kind of thing that you're going to have to keep up with. Now, you brought up a good point. If they're in the veggie garden versus the lawn and the landscape, you're right there. We haven't talked maybe enough about reading the label. So whenever you use a pesticide, you got to make sure you read that label very carefully. Some products, if you have them in your vegetable garden or in an orchard, the fire ants, some of these products are not labeled for use around food crops. And that's where you have to use some of these back to those natural kind of organic products. There is something called an active ingredient called spinosad that is effective against fire ants, that it is labeled for use in vegetable gardens and orchards. So again, read that label carefully. For fire ants, it's going to be a baited thing. It is important to know that in that website that we put there goes through some of the myths, right? The things you've heard that might work. So how many of y'all have heard about grits? Just put some grits on the pile and that'll take care of it. Yeah, not true. Doesn't actually work. Diatomaceous earth. I mean, obviously you're not allowed to put gasoline and all these other kind of products on the fire ant. That's illegal.
Well,
Not,
doing more harm than good at some of these
not
points.
environmentally sound. How many of y'all have heard about, digging one pile and throwing it into another, kind of like causing war amongst mounds? It can work in some places, but in Florida we have multi-queen or something or other. I'm a plant guy, but there's something where that doesn't always work in Florida either. And then one that does work that you have to be really careful with is if you don't want to use products, is the boiling hot water, right? So you can use it, you just got to use a lot of boiling hot water to try to get down and really get the queen. So be careful if you take that route. But that web page on sustainable fire ant control is really great, kind of walking you through your options. And most of it's basically baited insecticide specifically for ants.
Awesome. Great answer. Yeah. I had the rude awakening when I went to read the label on the Amdro bait.
Mhm.
That it did not go in vegetable gardens, so had to resort to other methods. So yeah, so it's super important in this discussion to always read the label. Josh, back to the yard. What's the best approach to controlling everyone's favorite pest, the mole cricket, specifically in centipede?
Well, so first thing again, you need to be out there scouting and making sure that you know that you have mole crickets.
I
And
knew you were going to say that.
there's a couple ways to do that. And first of all, you're going to look for those little tunnels. There's a reason they're called mole crickets because they leave tunnels very similar to moles. And they're going to crawl across the ground and they're going to leave those little tunnels. Another way, and this is literally the only time I will ever tell you that it's okay to use soap when it comes to plants. There is a drench that you can do. It's a gallon of water to, I believe it's a tablespoon or maybe a tablespoon and a half of soap. And you pour that on about a 1 foot by 1 foot or maybe 2 foot by 2 foot area. And then you wait for them to come to the surface because it's going to coat them and they're not going to like it. And they're going to come to the surface to try to get out of it. That's another way that you can tell that you have them. With mole crickets, it's really a matter of prevention more so than treatment. You want to really do all the things again that are the cultural practices for your lawn to keep it healthy. Particularly in the case of mole crickets, you want to watch that moisture because they really like or they don't like the moisture. And so if it's too dry, they'll attack your lawn. So you want to keep that irrigation at exactly the right level, that 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch when the grass tells you it needs to be watered. Really keep up with that cycle. Of course, you can't do anything about the rain, but in that case, make sure your yard's aerated and make sure that you get good drainage and that rain does hit and then goes right through. Another thing you can do is turn your lights off at night. This is a flying insect and they do fly at dusk and they're going to fly and they're going to be attracted to pool lights and backyard lights and things of that nature. That also works right now for the termites that are flying everywhere because they're attracted to the same thing. So just turn your lights off at dusk and you can turn them back on an hour or so after the sun's gone down and you should be okay. But really it's more about prevention than anything else. There are some biological controls and some chemical controls that you can use if you have them and everything else has failed. They should be in the document that we linked, but really prevention is going to be your best bet with those.
Very good. Mark, you talked about leaf-footed bugs earlier. Of course, that's a type of stink bug. So could you give us some general information about stink bugs and how to keep them out of your garden? Not a huge landscape pest, but certainly in the garden they can be.
Yeah, they're definitely problematic in the garden. I mean, you can always, there's always praying and anti-stink bug dances and whatnot, but they do just tend to show up.
Maybe you can show
It
us
is.
some moves the next time we get.
Next time we have an agent meeting, I'll show you the anti-stink bug dance. Um, let's see, with stink bugs, it is important to know that we do have one beneficial stink bug that's actually preys on other problematic insects. So the predatory stink bug has these pointy little shoulder pad looking things, looks like Madonna. I think I've talked to you guys about this before, right? It looks like the old Madonna video with her spiky little shoulder pads. Uh, but besides that stink bug, all the other ones are kind of damaging usually. And usually it's because they damage fruit quite a bit, right? So they'll poke into the fruit to try to get some, energy, and they just damage tomatoes. They'll damage, I mean, pomegranates here have big problems with it. Stink bugs, a little bit like beetles, they have that exoskeleton that kind of makes some pesticides not super effective once they're already in the adult stage. And this is another one where you have to really try to get them in this case, it's the nymph stage. So before they become adults, you'll see a lot of leaf-footed bugs, especially, which are a kind of stink bug. There'll just be a big congregation of these little orange insects all together, orange and black, and that's really your best chance to get some good control of them. So we go right back to the whole, monitoring, checking on your plants, paying attention, IDing what you're seeing, and then, finding the right product to get them. And so I think we put a really good, actually, Larry Williams, our extension agent over in Okaloosa County, he has got a really great document that we shared here, specifically about tomatoes, but he really gets into, how do you go about trying to get those stinking stink bugs out of there?
Love it. I'm looking forward to those dance moves as well. Josh, we're just kind of alternating between garden and grass here. So we're going to go back to the turf grass, Josh, and another one of our favorite pests, sand spurs or sandburrs, some folks call them. How can we get rid of those? Because sand spurs, I don't know if everybody knows, is a grass, and it's hard to get rid of grass inside of grass. So what can we do?
It is hard to get rid of grass inside of grass for sure. First thing, just like with insects, with your weeds, make sure you get a positive identification. There are chemical controls, but some work better. These are post-emergent controls, of course, which means you can see the plant. There's a wide array of chemicals, and some of them work better on things like sandspur and will still tolerate your grass and keep your grass healthy. So you want to make sure that you've positively identified it, because there's several plants out there, several weeds out there that produce those little burrs. I get all the time people bringing burrweed in and calling it sandspur. I'm sure you guys see the same thing. And so we have to get that education out there so that you're identifying the correct one. Your best bet is probably going to be a pre-emergent herbicide program, because all of those seeds already exist in your soil. And so a pre-emergent herbicide program where we're putting down the application in the spring and we're putting down the application in the autumn. I think Matt linked the times and temperatures up above on our chat. If you're getting into that program, you're going to prevent a lot of these from ever becoming a problem in the first place. And as long as they're not a problem in the first place, they're not going to be a problem when you're seeing them. When you do that, the other thing you want to look at is keeping your grass healthy and keeping it watered appropriately, keeping it mowed appropriately, keeping it fertilized appropriately. That's going to be the solution, by the way, for every lawn problem you have. Is know what kind of grass you have, and those three practices should be the ones that you focus on. Healthy grass, stress-free grass is going to fill in your lawn area, and it's going to prevent a lot of these weeds. It'll shade them out and keep them from ever getting the sun they need to germinate in the first place. So that's probably your best control for weeds, but a pre-emergent program is a very close second.
All right. Awesome. Yeah, that's a pesky weed for sure, and a painful one at that. Mark had a question come in about grass control and landscape beds. Could you maybe touch on that? Just if you do get, torpedo grass or Bermuda grass or something like that, or even your lawn grass invading around ornamental landscape plants in a bed, what can you do about
Yeah, so we'll go back to our IPM thing, right? We were monitoring, we noticed these grasses are kind of invading these beds. There's the preventative things we can try first. We can make sure that we, put down some mulch, that we're not bringing in any weed seeds when we're planting anything else in there. We're not, using the mower and kind of blowing all the seeds and clippings into the bed. But then, there's hand pooling, right? So if you have something like centipede or St. Augustine or zoysia that's just kind of, invading and going past the border, those are things that you can easily kind of just yank out of there with your hands. But, torpedo grass, Bermuda grass, some of these really annoying nutsedge, right? Some of these annoying things that kind of pop up in your beds. Hand pulling just seems like futile, right? You pull it and it just pops up the next day. And that's where, again, especially if you can't handle it anymore, that's where these herbicides come in handy. And so, I mean, in this case, if you have a perennial bed that's mulched and you got these kind of grasses invading, a real common one to use would be something like glyphosate, which is the common ingredient in a lot of the Roundup products. That's what, you do a quick little spray, bing, bam, boom, all done. It's going to be something again you have to keep monitoring because I likely those plants are going to keep coming in. Bermuda grass and torpedo grass, just yeah, nutsedge, right? All these I mentioned are just we used to tease that you could pave it over, right, Daniel? Chris Marble would come and say, yeah, you can pave it over. But nutsedge will pop up through asphalt, about a week after it gets laid. And so it's just a constant maintenance concern or activity. But hey, we're gardeners. We like to get outside. We like to do things. We like to stay busy. So that's what weeds are for.
All right, very good. Josh, there are some lawns in the area that have St. Augustine grass, and that's probably the grass that's the most susceptible to various kinds of pests and has the most fungal issues and that kind of thing. So if you do deal with a fungus in St. Augustine, like gray leaf spot or large patch, something like that, what can you do to deal with it?
Helps if I turn the microphone on. This is another deal where prevention is going to be a lot easier than the cure. And so funguses always thrive in high moisture. One of our biggest issues here is that people are overwatering their lawns for the most part. Not everybody does, but for the most part, they think because it's hot, they need to put water on their lawn 3 and 4 times a week. In reality, you only need to put water on your lawn when the lawn tells you it needs it. You're going to see those grass blades will fold in half. You get some slight color changes. And then if you're not getting any rebounding when you step on that grass, that's when you need to water, but you only need a 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. And you only need it early in the morning before the sun comes up. If you can get as much moisture out of your lawn system as you can possibly get in the first place, the chance of you getting a lot of fungal issues dwindles quite extensively. Another one is you don't want that water just sitting at the surface. And so making sure your soil is not compacted, that's where our aeration comes in. That'll help some of that moisture move away from the surface too and help prevent some of these funguses. If none of that works, if you're doing all of that already and you're still getting funguses, take it to your extension agents. We need to identify what type of fungus it is, because just like our insects, certain chemicals work better on certain funguses. For the most part, anything that's copper-based is going to do a little bit better on a fungus, but you need to be careful with copper-based because copper doesn't move through soil very well. And while it is a plant nutrient that is needed, it's not needed in large amounts. And so if you go crazy with copper-based fungicides, you could kill your plants that way. So you need to be very deliberate about identifying what it is, and we can do that for you. And if you bring a little sample into our offices, usually a 1 foot by 1 foot, right where the brown meets the green, and we can throw it under a microscope and we can usually figure it out. Be very cautious with using chemical controls for it. And some of those funguses, the chemical controls won't even work anyway. So we really do need to identify it. So keep the moisture out. If you're doing that and you're still getting the funguses, come talk to us and we'll help you figure out what to do.
Awesome. Great answer. Mark, this is an interesting question. This client says, this spring we noticed stunted leaves on beautyberry and sunken areas in coral honeysuckle leaves. Of course, those are two native plants that are pretty tough. What would be some pest options that could have caused something like that? And is treatment even necessary in a case like that? Once you see it.
Yeah, that's a good question. What is it, and do we need to do anything about it? So, both of these native species, I have noticed on the beautyberries, they get, I think it's a mite. I haven't confirmed it, but the damage that they get reminds me a lot of these, like, little mites, tiny little piercing sucking insect. Usually it's those piercing sucking insects that cause the cupping and the weird kind of deformation of the leaves. Now the thing is, do we need to do anything about it? These are native species, right? It's a native plant, a native insect. They probably worked this thing out. And so it's more of a matter is, can you handle the damage? If the aesthetics of it look terrible, and you have a wedding and all your beauty berries are looking terrible, then maybe, you find a miticide that can effectively control it. First, again, I would take it into the office and, look under a microscope and we confirm and make sure what that pest is. As for the honeysuckle, I haven't noticed a damage quite like that, but it's kind of the same issue where a sunken, area on a leaf reminds me of like leaf spot or something, more of like maybe a fungal disease is kind of what comes to mind, but I'd have to see it and look at it. But I would say the same thing. Like if the aesthetics of it, if the overall look of the plant is still great, it's blooming, it's having new growth, then I might just leave it and wait it out. And because sometimes again they're cyclical, the pest will the cycle will move on, and the honeysuckle will be fine.
And the last question that we had come through the chat that I saw was some leaf miners in our vegetable plants, in particular cucumber. Is this something that we can treat or need to treat, or is that more just a cosmetic issue? What do you think? What do y'all think about that one?
Leaf miner and cucumber, I might just leave alone. Because you got to use systemics mostly to get leaf miners, and you don't want to usually use those on your fruiting food plants.
Yeah, and
Josh, you agree with it?
yeah, and usually by the time you're seeing that damage, whatever insect that caused it is gone. So treating it anyway is you're just treating a leaf and not the actual insect.
And just so everyone, leaf miners, you get those cool little designs in the leaf. The sucker's inside there, and so a lot of the spray products that hit the top of the leaf, they don't get to it anyway. So the citrus get them a lot. That's one where we just say, hey, like Josh has been talking about grass, just let the plant outgrow the damage, and usually it moves on.
Awesome. Good answer, guys. Well, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I appreciate the questions. They were awesome. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to email your extension agent in the county that you're in. There's one of us in every county in the state of Florida, so we can definitely help you with that. I would like to say our next Gardening in the Panhandle Live is going to be a couple months from now. We're taking a short break during the summer. We will return on August the 21st of 2025. So just a couple months from now, the topic will be the Great Southeast Pollinator Census. Be a citizen scientist. So that's going to be a really cool topic. If you're interested in pollinators, you're interested in pollinator conservation, wildflower gardening, all of those related things, it's going to be an awesome webinar, and we certainly encourage you guys to attend. But as far as today goes, that's all we have for you. Mark, Josh, y'all want to leave us with any thoughts for the day?
Pests are all over the place. Can't have a perfect garden. Just remember that most of the things you're seeing out there in your landscape are not eating your plants. They're not harming anything. They're just out there living their best life. So don't freak out every time you see a bug out in the landscape.
Fair enough. A true Mark answer. Let's hear from Josh.
I'd say don't jump right to chemical controls, just like we talked about with cinch bugs. If you overuse chemicals, they're going to develop a resistance to it. When I teach classes, I'll say if I have a bunch of aphids on that tree right there and I spray it and I kill 95% of them, well, 5% of them are resistant to that. And the next time I use that, after they repopulate, 100% of them are going to be resistant. So check your cultural controls, see if you can plant a little bit of a flowered area, even in a lawn, to attract some of those predators and parasitoids and control your pests that way as best you can. And then just make sure you have good, healthy, growing, stress-free plants as best you can.
Love it. So for Mark and Josh, I'm Daniel. This has been Gardening in the Panhandle Live on Lawn and Garden Pest Management. We'll see y'all in August, and be sure to keep the mothballs in the closet and out of the landscape. Good afternoon, guys. Y'all have a good one.
Thanks, Daniel. Have a good one, y'all.
Bye, everybody.